This is a podcast about new crops. You're going to love it. Join us on The Cutting Edge, a podcast in search of new crops for Wisconsin.
It's certainly a very important resource, and it's also a resource that we have to definitely treat with respect if we want to have it in the future.
Welcome to The Cutting Edge, a podcast in search of new crops for Wisconsin. I am one of your co-hosts, Carl Dooley, with the University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension, serving as agricultural agent in Buffalo County. And joining me as my co-host is Elena Voss.
Hi everyone, my name is Elena and I'm from Juneau and Sauk counties as an agriculture educator for UW-Madison Division of Extension.
Elena, I don't know about you, but I'm kind of excited about today's program. It's not our typical crop that we plant. Talking about the true wild rice, and I don't have a lot of experience in it, but how about you, Elena?
I don't, we get it from the store. We try to eat healthy, we enjoy that. But, we've had a lot of questions lately on people interested in rice.
Cool. Well, we have two experts with us today. We have Jason Fleener, who's with the Wetland Habitat Specialist with the Wisconsin DNR, and Chris Johansson, also with the Wisconsin DNR. So Chris and Jason, or maybe start with Jason, if you could just briefly introduce yourselves and tell us what you all do with the DNR, especially related to wild rice.
Sure. Good morning. My position is in the Bureau of Wildlife Management and DNR. I'm based out of Madison. So I have more of a statewide position. So my position covers a lot of different things. It focuses on wetland habitat for wildlife, primarily for waterfowl. So I help administer the state waterfowl stamp program for habitat projects. I help our managers in the field with the resources they need to manage their infrastructure for wetland impoundments. And then a cool part of my job is to help with wild rice conservation. So currently I am serving as co-chair on the state's Wild Rice Advisory Committee, and I also co-chair the Joint State Tribal Wild Rice Management Committee as well.
Cool. And Chris, if you could also just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you're related into the wild rice story.
You bet. Yeah, thanks, Carl. Appreciate the opportunity to be on the podcast today. So again, my name is Chris Johansson. My title is District Wildlife Supervisor for the Wisconsin DNR. So I'm based out of the Eau Claire office, and I have oversight of the wildlife management field operations in about 19 counties in the western side of the state. So how that relates directly to wild rice is we have habitat managers within all these different counties, and on some of our state wildlife areas we actually have flowages where we manage, and sometimes we are managing for wild rice. Today I would say that I'm wearing a different hat, and that's just kind of my own personal hat, where I've been an individual who has taken part in harvesting wild rice for about 20 years in Wisconsin. So I'm hoping I can share kind of some insight into the ins and outs of it and the practicality of how you actually go out and go about taking part in that activity.
Well, great. Thanks, Chris and Jason. And I do have to give Chris a little bit of kudos here, because he gave me my first sample of true wild rice probably 10 years ago, and found out what I was calling wild rice and eating before wasn't even close to what he gave me. But why don't we start with if you could, a brief history of what wild rice is and how it fits into the Wisconsin landscape.
Sure. I think I could take that one. So wild rice, you use the term true wild rice, and so I'll also refer to it as natural wild rice, which is a native plant in Wisconsin. And actually, we have two species of wild rice that occur in Wisconsin. One is commonly referred to as northern wild rice, and that's the species that people will typically harvest for food. And then we have southern wild rice, or also referred to as river rice, which you'll find oftentimes growing in river bottoms and those type of systems around the Mississippi River. the Wisconsin River, a lot of the back channel areas that you'll find that. So there's a long history of it that's really really deep with native cultures in Wisconsin, and since European settlement, also with settlers too. So it's there's a lot of value for wild rice placed on it as a natural community. It's ecological benefits, cultural and spiritual benefits as well.
Is there a real difference, or can you distinguish the difference between the river and the northern wild rice?
Sure. So if you look at each plant, the northern rice is actually a little bit shorter. So they'll look very similar, except for, I guess, the size and dimensions of the plant part. So the northern rice is a shorter plant. However, the seed is actually larger, and so that's what makes it so good for harvesting, is because it's low to the water, so it's accessible, and it's a larger grain. So the southern rice it can be very quite tall, and if you are on the surface of the water, it can extend perhaps up to 10 feet high. So it's quite large, very robust. It's a larger stem, thicker leaf, but as I said, the grain for that one would be smaller.
How do you find the difference between that and like a cultivated, what we're seeing in stores, things of that sort?
Sure. I guess I'm not real familiar with how the plant looks with a lot of the cultivated rice. I haven't visited any of the paddies, but yeah, so there's a difference. So wild rice has been domesticated, so to speak, over the years, and going back probably over 50 years ago, it was starting to be domesticated, and eventually through genetic modifications, you have this product that's suitable for harvesting by machine, and then these large impoundments. And you'll find most of the cultivated or farmed rice, you also hear the term paddy rice in Minnesota as well as in southern Canada. So the grain of that rice, you'll see, or you'll find that in grocery stores. A lot of times you'll see, wild rice harvested from Minnesota, which is great to eat, but the grain looks quite different. So if you take a bag of that, you'll see a very dark, like black grain sort of rice, whereas the true or natural wild rice that grows in the wild is typically a lighter colored grain. You have a lot more variation in the colors grains, anywhere from a light brownish color to different shades of gray and dark colors. So you have quite a variance in coloration. And so another difference is the way that the grains are cooked. So cultivated wild rice, you typically have to cook a little bit longer. So the natural wild rice tends to be a little bit softer in texture, and it has a little bit more of a robust flavor. But if you were to offer me both, I would certainly take and eat both in a heartbeat. But I'm not picky, but I am a little partial to the natural wild rice, being a harvester myself. So.
All
There you
right.
go.
Thank
Maybe
you.
maybe Chris, if you could comment a little bit. You talked about river rice, and I know you live close to the Mississippi, and I don't know if we have much of the river rice in the Mississippi backwaters, but in more general statewide, we know we have backwaters filling up with sedimentation and erosion issues. Has that done anything to the natural habitat for the natural wild rice, or?
Sure. Yeah, certainly, there are a number of limitations, and I would say threats to wild rice, and one of them certainly is sedimentation and erosion, that type of thing, where wetlands are filled in, or they're the sediment is modified. That's certainly a threat. And specifically to the river rice here along the Mississippi River, where I'm beaming in from the bluffs of Buffalo County, and the river is not that far away. We've actually seen an expansion of wild rice over the years within the National Wildlife Refuge system. And I think that part of the reason for that is certainly over the years we have seen the river has become, cleaner. It's become, the water quality has gotten better over the last 20, 30 years. In response to that, we've seen definitely an expansion of wild rice.
So besides us harvesting and eating wild rice, any wildlife really go after wild rice, or is it pretty much just us?
Go ahead, Jason. I'll let you
Okay.
take that one.
Yeah, I looked at Chris here. Both of us could answer these sort of questions, being biologists, but yeah, rice is very ecologically beneficial to a lot of different species, to waterfowl particularly, to both diving ducks and dabbling ducks. Will really find it highly nutritious and energetic, and it's especially important for migration, as these ducks will stop over and fly through in the fall, and they'll stop in these wetlands, and they'll find the grains of rice on the bottom of the sediment. And dabbling ducks, if they can reach down far enough, they'll pick it up. And then diving ducks, especially like ringneck ducks, really depend on wild rice. So especially in northern Wisconsin, it's a very important food source for ducks. So not to mention other wildlife species as well. Muskrats really will utilize it as a food source, and they help build their huts with the material. It's important for a lot of different types of birds that migrate, especially with rails, Sora rail and Virginia rail. The Sora rail is commonly referred to as rice birds by a lot of folks. Blackbirds will eat it, swans, the list goes on and on. So besides wildlife, fish will utilize it too. The rice beds in the summer provide really good nursery habitat for a lot of fish, good area to catch pike, bass, sunfish. So yeah, I can ramble on and on about its benefits to the ecosystem.
It almost sounds like you need a scarecrow out there. Oh, goodness.
I guess I'll just add a little bit to that as well, kind of from a management perspective, is wild rice is really unique and significant as well in some of the flowages that we have in northern Wisconsin and central Wisconsin that we manage, where we've actually been able to reestablish it. And it's unbelievable, the wildlife response that you get once you get wild rice into a water body, and all those species that Jason just identified. They will definitely respond positively, and they find that source of food, and they utilize it and depend upon it during their annual cycle. So it's just an amazing resource for wildlife.
Cool. Since you brought it up, let's go there. Talk about establishing it, and how do you go about encouraging wild rice growth, or how do you, quote, plant it? Obviously, you aren't taking a tractor and a grain drill out there. Describe the process of trying to expand or renew wildlife or wild rice plantings.
Sure. So wild rice, you can plant, I guess. So going back to the true natural wild rice versus paddy rice. So if one were to take this on Wisconsin, so DNR highly encourages folks to really understand where the source of rice is coming from, and for genetic purposes, we want to make sure that people are finding sources of natural wild rice. So if you were to buy it from a dealer or harvest it yourself, obviously it's natural, but you want to know where it's coming from. So that's one of the most important things. And if you look at rice, there's a lot of different genotypes of wild rice, and some are more adapted to deeper water, some are more adapted to shallow water or fast flowing water, vice versa. So knowing the characteristics of the ecosystem in which it came from is important. You want to try to mimic that and where you're going to transplant it. So you do not need a permit from Wisconsin DNR to plant wild rice, which is good to know. However, there are some guidelines or caveats that we really want people to be aware of. And one thing to be mindful of is when you plant wild rice, you need to understand the surrounding area. So you have to picture where you're seeding, that being a big rice bed and, that following fall or the subsequent years. So you probably don't want to plant on a lake where you're throwing it on your neighbor's shoreline, or near their shoreline, that is. So it does get quite thick, and if it's successful, it could block travel areas for boats. So that's something to be mindful of. Or it can block, viewscapes, and some people will certainly welcome that, but not everyone. So you just need to be mindful of that. So it can be planted on private properties. So riverbeds technically are privately owned, and so is the material that stems from them. So technically, if you were to seed on a riverbed in which the private land ownership extends to the channel, that area is privately owned and held. And so if one were to harvest that area, they would need permission from that landowner. Otherwise, generally speaking, lake beds of Wisconsin are the title of the state, and so that's where the public harvest comes into play. So, yeah, in terms of to get back to your question about how do you seed it or plant it, so wild rice is simply just broadcasted. That's it. You just throw it in the water, and you just want to make sure that you're getting green rice, so to speak. So it's unfinished rice. If you process the rice, then it won't germinate, obviously. So if you get a source of green rice, you want to plant it ideally within 48 hours after it's harvested, to make sure that it doesn't spoil. And you just simply throw it and broadcast it in the water by hand. It's that simple. The depth you want to shoot for is anywhere between 6 inches to 3 feet, where the high water mark normally is. And you would ideally plant it somewhere where there's a very gentle or soft current, and that's where it will thrive the best. An organic lake or river bottom would be ideal as well. So all those factors combined can help you figure out where to plant rice. Seeding rate recommended is about 50 pounds per acre. And if you can seed the same area 2 or 3 years in a row, then you'll be more successful in getting that bed established in the long term. So I know it's a lot to take in, but there is some guidance out there if anyone's interested in looking into it further.
And where would they look for that? Or they're looking for a dealer, or where are those resources located at? I mean, this is a very unique opportunity for individuals.
Right. Yeah. So if one were to obtain some rice, there's a few different options. One is they can harvest it themselves, and we'll probably get to that in a moment, talking about the harvest. But they can just get it themselves and then transplant it somewhere else. Otherwise, they can buy wild rice from dealers. There's a lot of wholesale dealers in northern Wisconsin, and especially in Minnesota. There's a lot of them. And I guess I couldn't point you to a particular place to find those dealers. I guess one good starting point would be to contact some of the Ojibwe tribal offices, and sometimes they have good connections with folks that will sell rice. Other than that, there are a handful of seed nurseries in Wisconsin that will sell it as well. The catch there is, like I mentioned before, if you get rice, you would want to seed it within 48 hours. So if that can't be done, the next option is to actually take the rice in like a feed sack and soak it for whatever period of time until it's ready to be seeded. So a lot of these nurseries will soak the seed in these sacks, and just a forewarning, it can be quite smelly. So so if anyone were to buy that, just be prepared for that. It's just the nature of the beast. In an ideal world, if you know of a water that's going to be seeded, and if you know that there's a lot of ducks and different types of birds that will eat it, If you can hold out until just before ice starts to form, so in a lot of areas that might be in like early November, that would be a good time to seed, because a lot of the waterfowl that migrate through will have passed through by then, and then that'll make sure that your seed is not eaten before it has a chance to germinate.
So on to harvest then. I know it's kind of a art form, I understand. Could you explain a little bit about the harvest? When, how you do it, what you're allowed, do you need permits, etc.?
Sure. I'll talk about that. First off, I think that it starts with understanding what the activity is and understanding a bit about the biology of rice. We talked about that, where you can find rice, those types of things. And I think that there's some really great resources for if there's someone listening and they're thinking, boy, I'd really like to take part in that. How do I do it? I think start on the internet and explore a little bit on our Wisconsin DNR website. We have some resources, and then there's a fantastic resource available through the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. They have a lot of information on rice, the significance of rice to the Ojibwe Nation culture, where you can find it, that type of thing. And I know for myself, every year I start by taking a look at that website in August, because what they do is they provide a great service in the fact that they are monitoring the rice beds, and they provide on their website actually the different water bodies and an assessment of how that rice paddy is looking, or that rice bed rather, is looking for harvest. So they have just an objective rating like average, good, excellent, something like that. So now once you've kind of gotten it scoped out, are you going to go to northwest Wisconsin, north central, northeast? I mean, northern Wisconsin is a big area, and identify your water body. The other things you need to be aware of is there are some very basic regulations, and you have to have a license. It's a very minimal license fee. It's $8.25 for an individual, and then there's a bonus there if you have that actually that license covers your spouse or a minor child if they live in the same household. So for $8.25, you're set on the license aspect. And then a couple other really important regulations are we regulate the size of the watercraft that you're using. So it can't be longer than 17 feet, can't be wider than 38 inches, and then can only be propelled by muscle, basically. So push pole or a paddle. So most people utilize a canoe. Canoe fits that bill extremely well. And then to actually knock the rice, we call knocking it in. So you're pulling the stem over and knocking it into the canoe. We regulate the size of the sticks that you can use. So 38 inches is the maximum length that can be utilized for that. And then the last really important regulation is we regulate the hours. So it's 10 a.m. to sunset. And then some bodies of water are actually date regulated as well. So they will open on a certain date, then they may close, and they may reopen, and that's just to make sure that they're regulating the harvest through that way. So those are the important things. And once you kind of get all those identified and figure out where you're going and making sure that you've got your license, making sure the season's open, you've hit those regulations, find yourself a good partner is the best way. And then it's a two-person activity. You hop in a canoe, you're in this rice bed, and one individual is generally in the back of the canoe with a push pole. So they're just standing there propelling along, and the other person is then doing the knocking. So they are extending their arms out and extending the stick as far as they can, and then gently sweeping back and pulling the stock back over the top of the canoe. And then it's a gentle stroke or a tap. So you're not really banging on it with that other stick. You're just gently stroking it, tapping it, and the rice that's ripe and ready to fall will then come off of the head, and then hopefully fall into the canoe. And that just continues back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And you mentioned it's an art, Carl, and I think that I'm certainly no artist, so I usually end up being the push person, but the person that's knocking, I've seen some individuals that are highly efficient, more so than others, and they just develop some technique. But it's definitely it's a thing of beauty actually to watch someone that's really great at it, and watching them as they gently bring that rice in and stroke it, and when the rice is falling well, they hit that and it just dances off the head of the rice and falls into the canoe, and you can hear it tinkle in. It's really exciting for an individual that's looking to harvest a bunch of wild rice, and knowing that in the end this is going to be coming back to as a processed product back to your pantry to eat throughout the year. It's really enjoyable.
Okay, now I do some work with small grains, so I'm looking at I can harvest even with my little plot equipment. I can do a couple acres a day, and that would equal a couple hundred bushel. So when you go out for 4 or 5 hours harvesting wild rice, how many pounds do you get in a good year, let's say, or an average year in the bottom of your canoe?
Well, I would say that that might be a little bit different depending upon each individual that you ask. But for me, my standard is if I spend 5 or 6 hours in a canoe and we come back with 100 pounds of green rice, to me that's a pretty darn good day. Others might say, no, it's 120 pounds. They might be a little more efficient than I am, but anytime that I can come off the water body with 100 pounds of green rice, that to me is a really good day. And that doesn't happen all that often. And it really depends upon the year. Sometimes we have really good rice yields, and in other years it's not as good. But I've had days when we've come off after 4 or 5 hours with just 30 pounds of green rice, but in the end you're still going to have a beautiful finished product after you go through that process to preserve it.
So taking green rice to make it something that'll store and keep, what do you got to do then?
What I do is utilize, there's a number of individuals throughout the state that have developed mechanized processes, I guess, to do that. And I use an individual up in Spooner, Wisconsin. I know another individual up in Hayward. But it really is very similar to what Native Americans did. It's just using a mechanized process, but the process is the same. First, you dry it out. So as soon as you're done with the ricing aspect, you come back to the landing, take it all out of the canoe, and take it. Usually, what we end up doing is putting it into feed sacks, and then bring it back to my house, and I'll spread it out on a garage on a tarp. On the garage floor on a tarp, and then it just dries there. And that's extremely important. And I should back up and just say, even prior to that point, as you're out there harvesting the rice, it's really important to pay attention to things like getting water in the boat, getting mud, sand, rocks, those types of things. My partner and I that I rice with, we always like to stop every 45 minutes or so and just kind of pick out some of the stems and some of the chaff and that type of thing that you get in there. So it really starts, the treatment of the rice is really important if you want a really good final product. So you've done that, you spread it out, you dry it, usually dry it for 2-3 days, periodically rotating it, raking it a little bit, something like that, just to mix it around and that moisture comes out. And then take it to a processor. And what they're going to do then is take that rice, and they generally batch them in their individual batches. And it's a process of heating it up in the first step, and that dries it out more. It loosens the hull, and then it goes through another process where the hull is actually removed from the rice. And then the final step then is basically winnowing, where just taking a fanning mill and blowing all that chaff off, and then you're left with that really nice product of a beautiful finished grain of rice.
Cool. Now you mentioned the tribes a couple times, and I know wild rice is really important. Could you talk about what are the first of all, what native tribes are really involved with wild rice? Is it important to all the tribes in Wisconsin? And what does it really mean to them in their culture?
Sure. Yeah, I can definitely speak to that, and certainly recognize that I'm not a member of the Ojibwe tribes, but I'm certainly again a ricing fanatic, and learning more about the activity that I'm doing. You can't go ricing without appreciating the cultural significance of wild rice in Wisconsin to the Ojibwe people. And this goes back hundreds, thousands of years, actually, when um, the Ojibwe people settled in Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota area because of wild rice, where they were out in east of where they are now. And basically they were, there's a oral tradition that they were told to travel to where they'll find the food that grows upon the water. And that was wild rice. And they ended up in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan. So historically extremely important to their physical and spiritual sustenance, and still today extremely, extremely important to their tribal traditions, their sustenance, all those things. And they play a huge part as well. And I think Jason could speak to this even more in management of rice in Wisconsin today.
Yeah, really, for all the recognized tribes in Wisconsin beyond the Ojibwe tribes, there's 6 of them in Wisconsin. I believe all of them have some history or importance or connection to wild rice. The Menominee is another one of them. If you think about the tribal word Menomin, that's it has a lot of different ways that could be written, but that's the root word of the Menominee people as well. So beyond that, yeah, I think all the tribes have some connection to it. And even further west, beyond Wisconsin, you have the Dakota people too, who also have a deep connection with wild rice. And going back hundreds of years, there was often wars over wild rice between tribal peoples as well. And that speaks to how important it is. So, it's not just a resource, it has a deep spiritual connection too with tribal people. And, I think that's lost on a lot of non-native people, just due to that spiritual connection. And it's not just a resource, it's a being. So it's something that really needs to be understood, I think. So with the Ojibwe tribes, there are 6 in Wisconsin, and what's really important about our history is in the early to mid 1800s, there were treaties with the U.S. government, and in those treaties, it asserted that beyond reservations, that in the ceded territory of Wisconsin, that the Ojibwe tribes especially have rights to harvesting wild rice, and that was specifically pointed out. And that was solidified in the Voigt case, not so much in the distant past, in the 1980s, and with that, the Voigt task force was formed, and then also that's how our joint Wild Rice Committee was formed. And so that it formed a good relationship between the tribes and the Wisconsin DNR to manage wild rice. And so we work cooperatively on a lot of projects, and we, as Chris mentioned earlier about the date regulated lakes, we work with the tribal rice chiefs in figuring out when the best time is to open those lakes in terms of when it's ready. So yeah, there's a long history between the tribes and the state and the federal government.
You talked about how, some of these different national wildlife areas, there's more and more rice, and then there's the public harvesting. How does that process work for someone, that wants to potentially get into it, but don't want to step on toes or, cause any hiccups with another person that's also public harvesting? Can you kind of talk through that process?
You mean just make sure I understand your question correctly. So let's say you end up at a boat landing and there's 2 or 3 people and you all want to go out there at the same time.
Yep.
Yep. Sure.
Hey, Jason mentioned rice wars. We don't really want to have any more. So.
Yeah.
No, we definitely do not want to have rice wars. Well, a couple thoughts about that. First off, generally a lot of our northern Wisconsin lakes where we have large rice beds are big enough where you can have a fair number of people out there as long as they're respectful and respecting each other's space. And generally, when you have a nice big rice bed, what you'll end up doing is you're just going in a straight line. So you'll pick a line and you're gonna, it might be 200 yards long, and be just push pulling along. You've got your other person knocking, and then you get to the end of that bed, turn around and come back. So it's not like there's a lot of traffic going, in and out, back and forth. You all kind of get on a course and you take that. And I can say honestly, in 20 years of ricing, that I've never been on a body of water where I felt like, there's too many people here. We're competing. Usually, even in years where maybe the rice crop is not the greatest across the whole state, but you've got just a couple of bodies of water where it's pretty good. In those years, then you'll have more people showing up at one specific lake. And even in those situations, people are really respectful of each other, giving each other space. And I've never seen an instance where, we're approaching a rice war. So, but that being said, I think it's important for folks to know if they're new to it. The other thing is, if you're standing at a boat land, you're both going out, just talk. Where are you going? Which way are you going? And if there's two areas on a lake that's got rice on it, why not separate and go out and take a different part of the lake? But so yeah, even that's kind of a fun activity because it's relatively quiet, and as you're going along, you sometimes you can't see because the rice is so tall. You don't even see anyone else. You just periodically see a push pole come up into the air and see the top of someone's head or something like that, and there's not a lot of noise or commotion. There's no boats or there's no motors running. So you'll be going along and all of a sudden, geez, there's somebody right there, and you'll pass and you don't even realize it because it is such kind of a quiet solitude activity.
One thing I'll add to that is I think between rice harvesters, I think it's not so much a space issue that causes conflict. I think what really gets to some harvesters is that other folks, whether if they're just beginning harvesters or veterans for that matter, will harvest either too early or with an improper techniques. So this relates to respecting the resource. And oftentimes if folks get out too early, as Chris mentioned earlier, the rice, if you're taking the ricing stick and then you're gently raking the tops, it should fall very easily into the boat. And if the rice is not ripe or ready, it won't fall. And so some people will try to force it by whacking it hard. And then what that does is that will take the milk stage of the rice if it's undeveloped, and then it could impede its growth and development, so it will not mature. And then furthermore, it'll kink the stems of the plant if you're really whacking too hard. And I think that's what really gets to some ricers who really know what they're doing, or who really respect the resources, that some others won't understand that. So if folks are looking to harvest rice for the first time, one thing I would recommend is if you know somebody, or if you can get lined up with somebody who has done this before, they can really show you the right timing technique. That would really be helpful. Otherwise, you can watch videos online through YouTube's got a lot of great videos on that. And I think one thing in DNR that we're working on is to try to come out with more videos that really talk about the timing and the different stages of growth and whatnot. So stay tuned.
Yeah, related to that, I know DNR does a lot of educational programs at parks, etc. Do you do any Wild Rice Harvest 101 type programs, or do any of the tribes have an organized program like Wild Rice 101, learn to respect, learn how to harvest, etc.?
Yeah, I think the tribes have done a better job at that. In some cases, they'll have rice camps. You'll hear that term a lot, and that the rice camp is really a concept that dates back hundreds of years, where where tribes will travel from lake to lake and then set up camp and harvest the rice and then process it. But I guess the modern term of a rice camp is, or a training session, is that you would have somebody who knows what they're doing and then teach a group of people. So I've seen some organizations do that as well. DNR has not gotten into any sort of proactive sort of training or teaching, but that's something we could definitely look into in the future here.
And then one other question I had for you guys, we talked about how we have some wildlife that kind of, like to enjoy the rice as well. But do you find any issues with diseases or, weeds, especially, there's concerns with invasive weeds in our lakes, rivers, streams. Are we seeing any issues with that with rice areas as well?
Yeah, so maybe I'll take the first part of that question first regarding diseases. So there is a common disease that affects rice, and it's called brown spot disease, and it's a fungal disease that in some cases can essentially wipe out a rice bed. So the brown spot will settle in late in the summer, oftentimes when the rice kernels are maturing or during that stage. So if you see a bed that's been affected, as its name would imply, you would see the green leaves of the rice that have all these little brown spots on them, and from a distance you can even tell the difference in some cases if the bed is infected bad enough, and so yeah, that will affect the maturity of the grain, and ultimately it could affect the long-term sustainability of a rice bed on a body of water. So that's definitely a concern, and we don't understand brown spot really well yet, but we suspect that climate change is exacerbating the brown spot disease. So something we definitely look out for. Other than that, there's a type of moth that in the larval stage, it's called a rice worm, that you'll find a lot of times in rice beds. And so I'm sure Chris can attest to this. I'm sure he's had a lot of worms he's dealt with in the past. You'll find worms and spiders that can tend to bite you. And so they will eat the rice themselves. But this, I guess it's part of the natural system and just the way that Mother Nature intended, I suppose. So you'll find that. So the second part of your question is invasive species. And so one thing to keep in mind is that rice is an annual plant, and so it reproduces totally by seed, and it's like an early successional plant. So in other words, it prefers disturbance. So if you're able to draw down a flowage or do something different with water levels, that will ultimately impact the aquatic plant community as a whole, and it gives wild rice an edge. So if you see an impoundment that's drawn down, or in a dry drought year on a natural lake, you'll see that rice really will flourish in a lot of cases if the seed bank is still there. So so yeah, wild rice will compete with aquatic vegetation. A lot of times that's native, like water shield and pickerel weed and things of that nature. But otherwise, invasive cattails, Phragmites are becoming a greater concern as those species tend to migrate further northward with climate change, as well as Eurasian water milfoil. So those are, so really need to manage the aquatic plant community as a whole to get good rice.
And some of these, some of the lakes around here anyway, they're taking drastic measures to try to, cut down on the weeds and some of those things. And sometimes they put out, chemical or things of that sort. Is that a concern? If someone were to put chemical out, is obviously that may affect the crop as well.
Yeah, certainly. So, if anyone is to apply chemical, like as a lakeshore owner, for example, they should really check with their lakes association to see if there's any sort of permits that they've obtained. Otherwise, folks need to contact the Wisconsin DNR, the aquatic plant management specialist for their area, and determine what kind of permits they might need. And so during that screening or review, if you will, A lot of times those specialists will check to see if there is rice in the area, and sometimes that might affect the parameters of that permit or whether or not it's issued at all.
Well, you mentioned a couple things. You mentioned climate change, which affects a lot of areas. Chris mentioned some of the sedimentation may help some of our beds. What is the future of wild rice in Wisconsin? The true natural or native wild rice?
Yeah, so it has an uphill battle. I think, over the decades, we've seen a loss in terms of distribution throughout the state and the sustainability of a lot of beds, and there's so many different confounding factors that affect rice. So another one is just land use and the alteration of waterways, water flow, subsurface water, and surface water. So roadways, culverts, ditches, dams, they all affect water flow, and oftentimes that's to the detriment of rice because, as I mentioned before, rice needs certain conditions to thrive. The water depth, the flow, things of that nature. So human activity has really altered the landscape, especially in northern Wisconsin. Um, so yeah, it's really important to be mindful of how those activities are affecting our waters. Um, Number two, I would say is the use of watercraft on a lot of these waters. So one important thing is for rice during its growth stages is um, during the late spring, early summer, in May and June is when rice will germinate. It comes through the water column and then eventually it reaches the surface. So it's an emergent plant, but before it emerges from the water, there's this stage called the floating leaf stage. And so the root systems are not really fully well developed yet at that point. And so one of the biggest threats is watercraft use. And so a lot of times with wakes and wave action, that will actually disturb the water column and uproot a lot of the plants. And so you'll also see that from heavy rain events, from flooding, and I mentioned climate change as being one of the factors. So those sort of things can really wipe out a rice bed, and a lot of people don't even realize that it's happened because they see this. They might see this plant coming out, but they have no idea what it is. So it's important to be mindful of that. If local ordinances can be adapted for, slow no wake in those areas, in those important rice bed areas, that would really help. So yeah, otherwise climate change is another big one, and that affects so many different things. We're projecting there to be more heavy rainfall events, more flooding that will affect rice. We're dealing with in north central Wisconsin and the Highland area right now. There's a long-term period of high water table, and that has taken a lot of our important historic lakes and that are really suffering right now for rice just because the water is so deep in those areas. So that's a big concern. Carp is another one. Some lakes in Wisconsin, I'll take Clam Lake in Burnett County has been dealing with common carp, have been battling those issues. It's been a historic rice water, and there's been a lot of contracting efforts to remove the carp on that lake. And ultimately, carp will disturb the sediments and uproot a lot of the rice. And so what you saw over decades is that those rice beds have been declining, but now over the last couple of years, I think we've seen a good result of those carp control efforts, and you've seen the rice come back in a lot of those bays. So that's another threat, and the list goes on and on. But the department and the tribes are really working together to address those issues the best we can.
Great. This has been super. I learned a lot. I hope our listeners do also, and I really appreciate Jason and Chris for being on today. Any last comments that you would have about wild rice and that listeners should know?
I was going to say, any tips that you would have given yourself if you were starting out again?
I would say that Jason really nailed the biggest tip that I could provide on harvesting wild rice and participating in it. And that is, if you can, identify someone who's done it before, like anything, to shorten the learning curve. And I guess I would just, kind of wrap up saying it's a really, really enjoyable activity, and it's a really unique activity here in Wisconsin. And if you've never done it and you enjoy outdoor recreation, and you enjoy harvesting your own food, taking something, a natural renewable resource, and taking it back to have later throughout the fall, throughout the winter, as a great source of food, then I think this is a fantastic activity that you should think more about and explore. And the final thought I have is just treat wild rice with a high level of respect. And we touched on that earlier, but it's certainly a very important resource, and it's also a resource that we have to definitely treat with respect if we want to have it in the future. So learn more about it, utilize it, and treat it with respect. Yeah, I encourage anybody to try it that's never done it.
Great. Jason, any last comments?
Yeah, just do your research if you're interested in harvesting. Even if you don't know somebody who's harvested, and if you just want to try it on your own, don't be bashful. Do your research first. And DNR's got a good wild rice webpage. Go to dnr.wi.gov, search for wild rice. That'll bring you right to our page. The regulations are all there, a lot of good information and facts. Look at, watch our video, do YouTube videos, things like that. Plan ahead. Before you know it, late August, early September are the peak times for harvesting rice. So do your research and planning ahead. And if you're going to harvest, make sure that you have a processor lined up ahead of time and communicate with them so you know where you can drop your rice off right away, so you're not wondering what to do with your product.
Cool. Jason and Chris, thank you very much. I think Lane and I have enjoyed this a lot. It's not our typical new crop, emerging crop that we're looking at, but I think we did learn that there are some things we can do to help cultivate, so to speak, wild rice, or at least expand beds and help the planting. So thank you all. Again, this has been the Cutting Edge, a podcast in search of new crops for Wisconsin, presented by UW Wisconsin Madison Division of Extension. Thanks again, and we hope to see you all again soon.
Brought to you by the University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension.